Hi everybody, welcome back to Philosophy of the Paranormal with me, Dr. Josh Redstone. Today we're going to be taking a look at a couple of short papers, one which deals with the history of the term paranormal, and the other one which outlines the history of parapsychology. So we'll be taking a look at these in brief to kind of orient ourselves so that when we proceed toward our future lectures, we'll have a bit more of a firm or a more firm understanding, if you like, of what the paranormal is and what parapsychologists do. But before we do that, there's a little bit of housekeeping I'd like to take care of. So, Note-Taking Services is seeking a volunteer note-taker for this class. I'm just going to read you the notice that I got from Note-Taking Services, Volunteer Note-Taking Services, and the Paul Menton Center for Students with Disabilities. So, you can find this in your slides as well, by the way, on slide number 3. The Paul Menton Center for Students with Disabilities is seeking a volunteer note-taker for this class. That's Phil 2405A. This volunteer role is very easy for you to do, and volunteers who successfully fulfill the requirements of the role are eligible to receive a letter of appreciation and a CCR credit. That's a co-curricular credit, so this will appear on your co-curricular record at the end of the semester. Volunteers must take notes for all lectures and have them uploaded within 48 hours of the lecture date. Notes can be typed and uploaded directly using your personal computer, or handwritten notes can be scanned and uploaded via Carleton Central. If you are interested in this opportunity, please email volunteer_note-taking@carleton.ca with your name, student number, and complete course code, including the section. So Phil 2405A. That's important if you decide to volunteer to have all of this information there. For more information, please take a look at our website, which you can find, I believe it's somewhere on the main Carleton website or the Paul Menton Center website. In any case, this is just a notice for someone to take notes for those of us in the class who might require that as part of their academic accommodations. Now, I realize you might be thinking to yourself, take notes? What? That's a video lecture. It's not a regular lecture. I wasn't planning on taking notes. But I actually do recommend you take notes in this class, even if you're not interested in this volunteer note-taker position. I hope, by the way, that one of you will volunteer for this. I don't actually use lecture notes for these kinds of classes. However, I think it would be beneficial to you to take notes. And here's how I recommend you do that, whether you decide to volunteer for this or not. Firstly, I think the easiest way is for you to print out the slides that I've made to accompany these lectures. And you can find all of this information on slide number 4, by the way. Print these out as handouts. You know, when you print slides out as handouts, you have the slide on one side of the paper, and then you have a number of lines on the other side of the paper, and you can fill in notes on those lines. This is what I recommend you do for this class, is to print these out in handout view or in handout mode, or excuse me, whatever it's called in Microsoft Word, or Microsoft PowerPoint rather. Print them out and make notes as if this were an in-person lecture. I will share other videos as well, which will not be, part of this video lecture, but I'll provide links in the video description here. You can also find links to the videos I recommend you watch as supplementary materials in the lecture slides that I've prepared. I recommend you take notes when you watch these, if you find that helpful as well. And for that matter, it would probably be helpful to you if you made notes in the margins of your readings. But you don't have to do it this way. You can type up your notes as you're watching or listening to this lecture. You can just write them down on regular old lined paper, do it old school if you want to. But I do recommend that you take notes for this class because they will be very helpful for you when it comes to prepping to write your critical responses and your essay, which, remember, serves as your final exam in this class, your final take-home exam. So that's the housekeeping stuff. Number one, we need a volunteer note taker for this course, and it would be really great if one of you volunteered to do that. You can find all of the information for that on slide number 3. But even if you don't want to volunteer, I recommend you take notes in this class. It will work to your benefit to take notes in this class, and it will help you, shall we say, assimilate the material a lot better. All right? So that's all for the housekeeping stuff. Now, let's talk about the paranormal and parapsychology. Right, so before we get into talking about what exactly the paranormal is, let's just go over the description, once again, that is provided in the course outline and which you can also find on slide number 5. So, in this class, we will critically examine claims, concepts, and theories related to the paranormal. That is, phenomena which purportedly lie outside of the realm of everyday experience and or scientific explanation. Using an interdisciplinary approach, we will examine the scientific character of purported paranormal phenomena, in addition to their relation to philosophical questions surrounding human nature, thought, perception, and reality. So, the key for today's lecture is phenomena which purportedly lie outside of the realm of everyday experience and or scientific explanation. This, for the purposes of this class, is how we will understand the paranormal. But what do I mean by everyday experience? Well, whatever the paranormal is, it must be something unusual if it is to lie outside of the realm of everyday experience. Something that perhaps we've heard folk stories about, but we haven't encountered ourselves. You know, a lot of you have probably heard spooky ghost stories, for example, but never encountered anything that you've taken to be a ghost before. Or perhaps you have. If you have, you can let everyone know in the comments if you like. But the idea here is that not everyone has experience with these kinds of phenomena, whatever they are, whether they are supernatural in some way, or whether they are explainable scientifically using the present understanding of nature and the natural world that we currently have. So this is something that we might hear folk stories about, or creepy campfire stories, second-hand, third-hand testimony, these kinds of things. So not everyone experiences this kind of thing, but maybe the odd person has, and that's how you've heard about it. Of course, I mentioned ghost stories. Here I think not just tales about ghosts or creepy stories you might tell around the campfire are particularly good examples, but also stories of alien encounters, for example, right? There are cases of people that report being abducted by aliens, and obviously that's something that lies outside of the realm of everyday experience, whether you're actually being abducted by aliens or not, whether there's something else going on. I mean, I want to talk about this more when we actually have our lecture on UFOs and ancient aliens, but I mean, the long and short of it is, as I mentioned in my last lecture, I am a skeptic when it comes to the paranormal. On the other hand, when you consider the immense size of the universe and the number of stars with planets around them, there must be habitable planets out there in the universe that also have intelligent life. I take that as very reasonable, a very reasonable proposal. But are they actually visiting Earth and abducting people and probing their various orifices? This, I think, we should be skeptical of, because as we'll see when we explore this particular topic in our lecture, there are other phenomena such as the phenomenon of sleep paralysis, I should say, which might explain cases of apparent alien abduction when people claim to remember being abducted from their bedrooms and so on and so forth. But even if you say well, probably there are aliens, but they're not abducting people and experimenting on them. It's probably something else going on. That something else is still not really an everyday occurrence for most people. A lot of people have never experienced a case of sleep paralysis, which, again, if you're not sure what that is, let me know in the comments section, but I will be talking about this in more depth during our lecture on aliens and UFOs. Similarly with mysterious creatures, right? Like Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster, the odd person claims to have seen a creature like this, and whether or not it is an actual cryptid, if you like, or cryptoid. I'm not sure what the technical term is amongst cryptozoologists. But whatever it is, even if it's a case of mistaken identity, a bush or a different animal for Bigfoot, these are still things that don't happen that often. So even if they have naturalistic explanations, they can still lie outside of everyday experience. Now, one thing that I think we'll really have a chance to examine as this course unfolds is this element of mysteriousness, or the emphasis that's placed on purported paranormal phenomena, is that they're not just not everyday occurrences, they're also very strange occurrences. And this is something we'll probably touch on in our lectures on the uncanny as well. But just know that for now, the strangeness or mysterious of purported paranormal phenomena is another thing that should be emphasized. Not only are encounters with the paranormal not part of our everyday experience in that they are rare events, they're also very strange events, right? And that's why shows on television that deal with the paranormal often have titles like Unexplained Phenomena or Unsolved Mysteries or, something like that, right? So, it's not just in the sense that these occurrences are rare, they're also odd or unusual. So that's important. So that's what I want to say for now about this everyday experience element. So paranormal phenomena are phenomena which lie outside of the realm of everyday experience in the way that I've just described. But what about scientific explanation? Well, some paranormal phenomena, probably a great majority of paranormal phenomena, purportedly lie outside of scientific explanation. That is, that these are things that science cannot yet explain, right? This is rather new, I would think. Relatively new. I mean, strange phenomena in the distant past, in our pre-scientific past, if you like, would probably be understood in some kind of folkish way, a folklorish way, or perhaps explained according to the prevailing religion or set of beliefs in whatever culture we're talking about, right? But relatively recently, post-scientific revolution, and especially in the 19th and 20th centuries, new sciences emerged, particularly parapsychology, to try to explain these purportedly paranormal phenomena, like we'll see when we discuss parapsychology, which studied psi phenomena or psychic phenomena, right? So the idea here is that this is something that science can't yet explain, or perhaps can't ever explain, right? And we can extend this idea to philosophy too, right? I mean, if you want to talk about metaphysics, metaphysics, by the way, if you're not familiar, is the branch of philosophy that deals with, I guess we could call the study of reality, right? It comes from Aristotle. He had written a book called The Physics, which was about the natural world, and the work which immediately followed it was the Metaphysics, or the Metaphysica, Bibliometaphysica, which is just the books that come after the physics. So metaphysics is like after physics, and it's just the study of reality in general. So what exists and what is it like is a common way that metaphysics is explained to new philosophy students, the study of what exists and what those things are like. Some metaphysical theories don't really leave room for some kind of paranormal phenomena. So take ghosts, for example. Most scientists and philosophers nowadays are what we would call substance monists. More specifically, they're physicalists. So there's one kind of substance that exists, physical stuff, matter and energy, right? That's why they're called substance monists. So on that account, things like, for example, the mind is just something that matter does. The mind is just something our brain does. So that doesn't really leave room for something like ghosts. On the other hand, substance dualism, where there are two substances, mind and matter, might leave room for something like ghosts, right? Because the mind is this non-physical substance. This is going back to the work of René Descartes, which we'll probably talk a little bit more about when we have our lecture on ghosts. But that's one metaphysical theory, substance dualism, that might allow for some paranormal phenomena like ghosts, whereas others, like naturalistic metaphysics, such as substance monism, particularly physicalism, don't leave room for that kind of stuff. So it's not just beyond scientific, it's not just that the paranormal is beyond scientific explanation. Often phenomena which are purported to be paranormal occurrences are outside of the metaphysical frameworks that scientists and philosophers use to understand what reality is like and what kinds of things exist. So that's one way in which the paranormal is beyond scientific explanation. Another thing that we'll see if you've read the paper by Hyman closely is that there is this idea in some circles that scientists, for whatever reason, are ignoring or actively suppressing the study of paranormal phenomena. So this is something that we often encounter amongst cryptozoologists or ufologists. So these are people that study mysterious creatures like Bigfoot or UFOs, respectively. As we'll see in the materials that we encounter throughout this course, many of these folks claim that mainstream science is ignoring or suppressing the truth about these phenomena, right? I don't believe this myself. And I find it's also very problematic. It's epistemically problematic. This is the same kind of attitude that you often see in a lot of conspiracy theories, right? So take any conspiracy theory you like. The moon landing, JFK's assassination, 9/11 conspiracy theories, or nowadays, I guess, QAnon conspiracy theories that's the big one. But, here in all of these, there's the idea that the mainstream, not just the mainstream, but the people in power want to keep something from you. They want to keep the truth from you. This is typical of conspiracy theories, and it's also typical of some accounts of the paranormal. And that is why we'll be critically assessing these accounts in this class, because as I said, this is an epistemically problematic attitude. And I think that will become clear what I mean by that as we proceed through the course. So I won't say too much more about it now, but this is typical of conspiracy theories. It's also typical of some branches of paranormal studies. Now, another thing we've got to talk about if we're talking about science is that a lot of what we're going to be taking a look at in this class is actually regarded as pseudoscience. And again, I think we'll see this when we talk about ghosts and in particular ghost hunting. Right? I mean, if we're talking about aliens and UFOs and stuff, there's ways to do that. There's ways to search for alien life, right, that are scientific, right? There's SETI, the program SETI, which listens for radio signals from other worlds, for example, right? That's an actual, properly scientific endeavor. But on the other hand, ancient astronaut theorists like Eric von Daniken or somebody like that, well, those folks are practicing what we call pseudoscience. And pseudoscience is something that appears to be scientific on the surface. Maybe it uses scientific sounding terminology or something like that. but in fact is unscientific because it has no regard for the scientific method, observation, hypothesis forming, hypothesis testing, that kind of thing, considering counter evidence, the principles of parsimony. These are important elements of science that I will explain as the course unfolds. Little nuggets that we'll kind of find and develop here and there throughout the course that pseudosciences don't really emphasize, right? And this is why they're pseudoscientific. They might seem scientific on the surface, but they're not really scientific. So a lot of, unfortunately, what we'll be looking at in this class would count as pseudoscience. So just keep that in mind, okay? You probably already knew to expect some pseudoscience in this class. So, but if not, just be aware. Some of the stuff we'll encounter will look scientific, but we're going to take a critical look at it, and I'm going to show you how it's not necessarily scientific. But in any case, enough about science. Let's go back to metaphysics for a bit. One thing I thought that I would emphasize before diving into Penman's paper on the paranormal is something called metaphysical naturalism. I mentioned metaphysics before. I mentioned a particular kind of metaphysics, physicalism. This is a little bit more broad than that, this idea of metaphysical naturalism. Sometimes it's called ontological naturalism, but basically it's a theory that makes claims about what kinds of things exist and what kinds of things do not exist. And according to metaphysical naturalism, the only things that exist are natural things, right? Matter and energy, the properties associated with matter and energy. Nothing supernatural, right? Metaphysical naturalism says that there is no supernatural. Anything that seems ostensibly supernatural or paranormal is really just something we haven't explained yet. So there are no gods, souls, paranormal phenomena, magic, occult stuff. None of that exists on metaphysical naturalism. And metaphysical naturalism is the metaphysical outlook that most scientists and philosophers take, whether they know it or not, right? A lot of scientists cannot be bothered with metaphysics. That's not what they do, right? They're not philosophers. But if you were to actually sit down and chat with them, their outlook on what kinds of things exist and what things do not exist would align with metaphysical naturalism. At least the vast majority of them would. Similar to metaphysical naturalism, and sometimes discussed as a part and parcel of metaphysical naturalism, is something called methodological naturalism. So this is a different kind of claim. This is metaphysical naturalism makes claims about what kinds of things exist or don't exist. Methodological naturalism is about the kinds of things that we can study, right? So according to methodological naturalism, what we can study and understand is the natural world, the natural universe, the kinds of things that natural scientists study now, so physicists, chemists, and biologists, and which natural philosophers would have studied in the past. Natural philosophers, by the way, are that's a word that that's just what we called scientists before the term scientist was invented, right? Like someone like Isaac Newton would have been a natural philosopher doing natural philosophy about the world, right? So methodological naturalism is just a way of saying that we can study and understand natural things using science or natural philosophy. We can't really study supernatural things, if they did exist, using the tools of science. But metaphysical naturalism is stronger in that it says that, well, supernatural things just don't exist. And speaking of the supernatural, one thing that I want you to keep in mind throughout this class is that sometimes the terms supernatural and paranormal are used interchangeably, but they are not necessarily the same thing. And this is important to keep in mind. Supernatural refers specifically to things that lie beyond the laws of nature. So some things that are paranormal might also be supernatural, right? Say if ghosts existed, that might be something that is both. But miracles, on the other hand, seem, at least to me, to be more supernatural than natural. Miracles are, like where religious people imagine that God has intervened in the world somehow and perhaps broken the laws of nature in doing so, right? So that's not paranormal, but it is supernatural. So a metaphysical naturalist, just taking a step back, would deny that the supernatural exists, as I mentioned before, but a methodological naturalist would say that, well, maybe the supernatural exists, maybe it doesn't, but we can't study it with science. It's just not what science does. Of course, whatever is supernatural or called supernatural, just like whatever we call paranormal, might just be something that seems supernatural or paranormal, but that we haven't explained yet. So that's something else to keep in mind. So that's my little preamble, but what about the word paranormal itself? When did it enter English, and how have we understood it and used it since that time? Well, that's what Penman talks about in his paper. It's very short. Basically what he does in this paper is take a look at how the word paranormal entered English, which occurred around the early 20th century, beginning of the 20th century, how it was initially understood by the thinkers that used the term, and how it is understood in the present day. So let us take a look at that now. Hello. All right, so taking a look at Penman's 2015 paper, he starts off by pointing out how he and his students noticed this kind of anomaly in the Oxford English Dictionary. Now, dictionaries aren't just, what are dictionaries? Dictionaries are, in fact, collections of words where the words are defined according to how they are used in the language. And Penman and his students noticed, Penman and his students noticed that the Oxford English Dictionary lists the first occurrence of the word paranormal in another dictionary, a 1920 revision of Webster's New International Dictionary of the English Language, which is weird because if it was already in another dictionary, that means the word was out there being used. That's kind of how he kicks off his paper. In any case, here, it is defined as, the paranormal is defined as, that is, phenomena analogous to physical phenomena but with no known physical cause, such as mediumistic raps, telekinesis, etc. Penman and his students realized, though, that if the word was in another dictionary, as I just indicated, it must have been in use prior to 1920. And indeed, it was, but it meant something different than it does today. Penman writes, and I quote, on page 31, post X-Files, you guys remember that show X-Files? The term paranormal is ubiquitous. In popular culture and some reference works, it is often used to designate all manner of supernatural phenomena, from psychic activity to spirit contact, sometimes branching out into incorporate subjects as diverse as extraterrestrial life, ghosts, cryptozoology, and the Bermuda Triangle. This was, however, not always the case, end quote. And Penman is absolutely right here. In 1920, or rather prior to 1920, paranormal, as we'll see, was actually limited to the kinds of things that parapsychologists studied. So psi phenomena, or, psychical phenomena, right? So here we're talking about things like telepathy, which is the idea of communicating thoughts from my mind to your mind. Vulcan mind meld, as it were. Clairvoyance, which is a bit like what we could also call remote viewing, knowing what is the case somewhere where you can't see mentally somehow. And psychokinesis, which is moving objects with one's mind. So this usage can actually be traced back to the 19th century, where a lot of these psi phenomena were previously called psychic phenomena. And during the 19th century, by the way, this was not a weird, spooky, paranormal term. It just, it was like psychic as in psychology, right? This was before psychology was really formalized as a discipline. In the late 19th century, psychology was still kind of figuring out what it was going to be. I guess if I can put it that way. So psychic or psychical phenomena could refer to any mental phenomena, not just including what we would nowadays call paranormal, but other things like memory, the emotions, consciousness, all could have been described as psychical phenomena in the 19th century. So that's what that means. In any case, we read in Penman's paper that in 1882, the Society for Psychical Research was founded by, well, three individuals here. We've got Henry Sedgwick, who was a philosopher, a classicist named Frederick William, that's a mouthful, Frederick William Henry Myers, and a psychologist named Edmund Gurney. So this organization, the Society for Psychical Research, was founded in London, England. It had an international membership, and it was devoted to understanding these psychical phenomena, but more in the parapsychological sense than I suppose the term had referred to previous to this, right? Right here, we read in Penman's paper that this society was devoted to understanding the mesmeric, psychical, and spiritualistic. So psychical at the time wasn't necessarily that spooky, but spiritualistic, well, at the time in the 19th century, there was a lot of talk about mediums, and seances were actually a very big thing, as we'll see in our lecture on ghosts. So that's the spiritualistic stuff like seances, talking to the dead, mediumship, perhaps clairvoyance and fortune telling and this kind of thing. Mesmeric phenomenon, on the other hand, well, this comes from Mesmer, who coined the term, or, well, I can't remember if he coined the term or if the term is named after him. But you may have heard of mesmerism, like I was mesmerized by something. Basically, it's what we used to call hypnosis. So anything mesmeric would have been related to hypnosis, autosuggestion, perhaps the unconscious, stuff like that. So that's what that all means. And anyway, we read further that, let's see, this is Myers writing in 1885, trying to coin a term, not paranormal, surprise, surprise, that would capture all of these interesting phenomena that this Society for Psychical Research wanted to study. So I'll read you here from Myers in an 1885 publication that is quoted in Penman's article. Myers writes, "I have ventured to coin the word supernormal to be applied to phenomena which are beyond what usually happens. Beyond, that is, in the sense of suggesting unknown psychical laws." Interesting. It is thus formed on the analogy of abnormal. When we speak of an abnormal phenomenon, we do not mean one which contravenes natural laws, but one which exhibits them in an unusual or inexplicable form. Similarly, by supernormal phenomenon, I mean not one which overrides natural laws. So this is important. He's not talking about the supernatural here. He's talking about what we would call the paranormal. For I believe no such phenomenon to exist, but one which exhibits the action of laws higher, in a psychical aspect, than are discerned in action in everyday life. By higher, either in a psychical or a physiological sense, I mean apparently belonging to a more advanced stage of evolution. End quote. So supernormal for Myers was a word that wasn't meant to describe anything supernatural in the sense that I discussed the supernatural earlier. Rather, it was an attempt to provide a kind of nomenclature to this psychical research, bunch of psychical researchers in this psychical Society for Psychical Research. What a mouthful. So yeah, this was an attempt at developing a nomenclature. Supernormal sounds like supernatural, but it's not. It's really more like what we would nowadays call paranormal, especially what parapsychologists would call paranormal. Now, supernormal worked until 1905. That is when paranormal entered the English language. And it came to the English language via the French language, via words like paranormal or paranormo. Excuse my accent. I do not speak French. But in any case, this word, the French word for paranormal, was popularized in works like Joseph Maxwell's book, Metaphysical Phenomena, which was published in 1905. In this work, Maxwell offered a definition of paranormal that aligns pretty well with the usage of supernormal. And moreover, it aligns with the understanding of what the paranormal is that we find in parapsychology, or previous to parapsychology to psychical research, if you want to call it that. So it concerns, the paranormal that is, concerns specifically psychic, mesmeric, or spiritualistic phenomena, right? So Maxwell writes, and again, this is from his 1905 book, but it is quoted in Penman. Maxwell writes, properly speaking, there is no veritable automatism in phenomena of sensitivity, but we can nevertheless distinguish therein, first, normal sensitive phenomena, that is to say, phenomena produced under physiological conditions, more or less well known, but frequent, such as hallucinations, hypermnesia, and second, paranormal phenomena. That is to say, phenomena which imply the existence of modes of perception to which the normal personality is foreign. Clairvoyance, clairaudience, telesthesia, not really sure what telesthesia is, telepathy, and exteriorization of motor power. That would be something like psychokinesis. So, Maxwell and Myers are both talking about the same kind of thing here. Something that may not lie outside of, a kind of naturalistic worldview, but something that is mysterious and has yet to be explained. Now, it's interesting here because another thing we get in Maxwell's quote, or the quote of Maxwell here, is that these are, whatever they are, rare and unusual phenomena, which fits nicely with how I've defined the paranormal for this class. And when we look at Myers' definition of supernormal, we see something really interesting. This idea that perhaps people who have these abilities represent another step in human evolution. I don't know if there are any comic book fans out there, but this kind of just reminded me of the X-Men, right? In any case, let's move on to discuss a little bit of commentary on Maxwell's definition here. In a review of Maxwell's work, J. Lewis McIntyre added in 1906 that the sensitives, Maxwell's term for those possessing psychical abilities, maybe what Myers would have called these, X-Men-like people who represent another stage in human evolution, are persons who are indeed paranormal, but who are not therefore to be described as degenerates, neurotics, or hysterics. So what he's saying here is these people are not mistaken or crazy or mentally ill. Rather, they have powers which at present transcend those of other men, but which may at some future phase of evolution become themselves the rule rather than the exception. This is something that's very similar to what Myers says earlier, right? Notice the similarity, that this is perhaps another stage in human evolution that we're looking at. Some kind of, X-Men-like transformation. Sorry, that's hyperbole, but you get the idea, right? Anyway, Penman in his paper notes how this definition, this understanding that Maxwell offers and that McIntyre comments on, incorporates elements of Myers' term supernormal, as I've already mentioned. So, not only was it thought that these people, these sensitives, as Maxwell would have called them, represented a future direction for human evolution, they also really capture how these phenomena are beyond normal experience, and at least at the present time, beyond scientific explanation. Again, I'm a skeptic. I don't think these things are beyond scientific explanation at all. In fact, I don't think in most cases anything super spooky is really going on. But that's something I should probably say for my discussion of abnormal, or not abnormal psychology, anomalistic psychology. When we have that lecture, I will compare and contrast parapsychology to abnormal psychology further. But in any case, just to wrap it up with the paranormal here, there were a number of journals at the time in the late 19th century and early 20th century that the Society for Psychical Research published. Other similar research groups published similar journals. You can read about those more in Penman's paper. In any case, these journals, which researched these psychic phenomena or psychical phenomena during the 19th and 20th century, 1920s and 1930s, kind of use the word paranormal and supernormal interchangeably, right? One author might use paranormal, another might use supernormal, but it was kind of like both terms were acceptable and meant about the same thing. But this started to change in the 1930s. In the 1930s, Joseph Banks Rhine, who we're going to talk about a lot more in a little bit, because he was kind of like the first proper parapsychologist, he published a number of works on extrasensory perception, right? He used paranormal, and his works were very popular. As we'll see, he was one of the first people to try and study this stuff really scientifically by today's standards. And he seemed to have popularized the term paranormal, which he used instead of supernormal. Now, I've mentioned before that paranormal nowadays refers to more than just psi or psychical or psychic phenomena. And this is something that Penman notes, as we've already read, right? Today, paranormal could refer to, mediumship, seances, spooky stuff like that, but it also might refer to UFOs and aliens, or the Bermuda Triangle, or Area 51, or Bigfoot, or anything like that, right? So, now paranormal, the meaning of the term paranormal is actually quite broad compared to its initial employment in psychical research and in parapsychological research. Now, parapsychology, as I've already mentioned, and as we will see in a moment, is way more concerned with psychical or psi phenomena. So, a parapsychologist is not interested in studying UFOs or alien abductions or the Loch Ness Monster or haunted houses or anything like that. In this class, though, we're going to have to kind of take a dual-pronged approach to this, right? I want to focus to some significant extent on parapsychology and contrast it with anomalistic psychology, which we will do in future lectures. However, I also want to look at stuff beyond psychical phenomena. And indeed, like as you're thinking of your choice for the special topics lecture, you might want to talk about something besides psychical phenomena. Maybe you want to talk about Bigfoot, or the Loch Ness Monster, or Area 51, or the Bermuda Triangle, or something like that. That's absolutely fine with me, and I would love to do that. But just keep in mind that when we're talking parapsychology, the paranormal refers to the psychical phenomena, right? Telepathy, telekinesis, clairvoyance, this kind of thing. But when we're talking, paranormal in the popular usage of the term, or the sense of the popular usage of the term, we're talking about more than just that. We're talking about aliens, Bigfoot, the Chupacabra, Loch Ness Monster, Bermuda Triangle. I'm trying to think of other examples, but I can't. But you should think of examples, because you need to suggest some for the special topics, which I'll discuss at the end of this lecture. Anyway, that's all I want to say about the paranormal, kind of like what the paranormal is, how this terminology, this nomenclature is going to be employed through this class, and how it has been used in the past and in the present. Now I want to take a quick look at parapsychology. We won't spend too much time on this because we're going to have a lecture down the road once we've already covered a kind of selection of paranormal phenomena. We're going to come back to parapsychology and look at it in detail and compare and contrast it with anomalistic psychology. But for now, I want to make sure we all understand what parapsychology is and how it got going beyond this psychical research that I've just talked about. So that's what we'll do next. All right, so let's talk a little bit about parapsychology before we wrap up today, just so that you kind of have an idea of what parapsychology is all about, what parapsychologists see themselves as trying to do, and what skeptics see parapsychologists as trying to do. So, the Journal of Parapsychology, and this is coming from Hyman's paper, defines parapsychology as, quote, the branch of science that deals with psi communication, that is behavioral or personal exchanges with the environment, which are extrasensory motor, and that means not dependent on the senses and muscles. So that's what parapsychology studies, according to Hyman. Psi is like a term that is meant to identify someone's extrasensory motor communication with the environment. That could be objects in the environment or people in the environment. So it includes things like ESP, which is extrasensory perception. That is, quote, the experience of or response to a target object, state, or event or influence without sensory contact. So this includes things I've already mentioned, like telepathy, clairvoyance. Telepathy, by the way, is like mind-to-mind communication, purportedly. Clairvoyance would be like remote viewing. Precognition would be like having like a premonition, like knowing what will happen before it happens, right? Psi also includes psychokinesis, sometimes called telekinesis. Oh, hello. Come on. Hi. This is the extramotor aspect of psi. So Hyman writes, a direct, or psychokinesis is, quote, a direct, that is mental but non-muscular, influence exerted by the subject on an external physical process, condition, or object. So moving things with your mind or influencing physical objects with your mind somehow is what psychokinesis is supposed to be. Now, like paranormal, parapsychology actually comes to English from a different language. But it doesn't come from French like paranormal does. Rather, it comes from German word, parapsychology. This was adopted from German by J.B. Rhine, who I mentioned previously. Now, J.B. Rhine borrowed this term from German in the 1930s, and we've seen already how it kind of helps replace terms like supernormal or psychical research. Now, Rhine was kind of like the first parapsychologist. There were people who studied psychical phenomena before Rhine, but Rhine was really interested in doing controlled laboratory experiments, and he wanted to do them with regular individuals. So, you remember before, Maxwell, Myers, those fellas, they thought that certain special folks had these powers, right? Or abilities, I guess is a better term. Rhine wanted to study everybody, not just people who claimed to be able to have this or that psychical ability, right? So he also, in so doing, avoided a lot of the other purported paranormal phenomena, which, nowadays we might lump in with the paranormal, but which Rhine was hesitant to. So this would include things like haunted houses, and basically anything that had anything to do with the possibility of life after death, Rhine actively avoided for whatever reasons. I suppose we can get into this a little bit more in later lectures. But basically, in the late 1920s, Rhine and his wife Louisa began working on parapsychology as a science, trying to turn it into a proper experimental science, a branch of experimental psychology at Duke University. And their experiments were, done in earnest. They weren't bad experiments. They weren't poorly designed. They weren't perfectly designed, but they weren't terrible either. And this was an honest crack at trying to identify whether these things really existed in the population. Psi abilities, I mean. So typically their experiments would involve some kind of card guessing. They would have a deck of cards that contained 25 different cards, and the cards could have one of 5 different symbols. So there could be a circle, a square, 3 wavy lines, a cross, a star. So these are actually called Zener Cards or Zener Cards. So each deck has 25, and each symbol occurs 5 times in the deck. And basically these cards can be used in experiments on telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, and that kind of thing. Knowing the number of cards in the deck and the number of cards that have this or that symbol, we know what the odds are if, for example, you were to try and guess which card was going to come out of the deck. We know what your odds are of getting that guess right by chance is the 1 in 5 or 20, 1 in 25 or whatever. I actually don't know the odds. I've just said we know the odds. What I mean is that these kinds of experiments would allow scientists to kind of calculate a baseline chance level and then see if any participants went beyond chance, beyond mere guessing. So rather than guessing, you can imagine a scenario where one person looks at the card and tries to telepathically communicate the symbol on the card to the other person records their guess. They do this through the entire deck, and they see if the hit rate is greater than chance. And if it's significantly greater than chance, it's supposed to indicate that maybe there was some telepathy going on, right? In any case, in his monograph entitled Extrasensory Perception, Ryan and his wife collected data on something like almost 91,000 guesses, 91,174 guesses to be exact. And the average number of hits or correct guesses per run of 25 was 7.1. So that's more than chance. The chance expectation is 5. So it seemed to the Rhymes that this greater than expected number of guesses could not have been due to chance. And so the scientific community began to take note. They began to take an interest in things like ESP, telepathy, clairvoyance, and whatnot. However, it wasn't long before these other researchers began failing to replicate the results. Now, some criticisms were offered at the time of the initial results. One kind of, I guess, branch of this criticism was that the statistics were not very rigorous, and there were also methodological criticisms. So methodological criticisms proved to be the most problematic. There wasn't really much that could be done about the statistical techniques or improving the statistical techniques that were being used in these experiments, because this is the pre-computer age, right? Nowadays, I can do an analysis of variance, some factor analysis, regression, t-tests, all these cool statistical tests that you guys don't have to worry about, fortunately. But I can do them all on this here laptop in a couple of minutes. Back in the day, you had computers, this is a few years after the Ryans were working in the 20s and 30s. This would have been more like 60s and 70s. But you had computers the size of rooms, and they worked on punch cards, perhaps, or required data to be filled in, and then someone else would have to input it, and they were slow, so you'd give your data, say what kind of analyses you wanted run, and then a couple weeks later you'd get your results back, right? So this is before computers were even that good. So we didn't have very good statistical tools that we could at least use practically, right? So it was the methodological criticisms of his work that were really the kind of thing that that did in parapsychology, at least for mainstream scientists. So methodological criticisms might be something like, not accounting for transference, like unconscious communication, not psychic communication, but perhaps unconscious communication, little unconscious tells that perhaps an experimenter might send to a participant, or vice versa, right? And you can read about a lot of these different examples of this kind of stuff in Hyman's paper. In any case, the Ryans established these basic procedures that would really be used by parapsychologists throughout the 30s into the 1970s. Again, mainstream science, mainstream psychology especially, kind of started to get more and more skeptical of this stuff, I guess probably, I would say, around the time of the 1950s. You can still find, up until the 1970s, quite a few big names in psychology talking about the possibility of psionic and psychical phenomena, but gradually these ideas were given less and less credence by the scientific community, at least by and large. But parapsychology did continue through to the 1970s and beyond. So basically the methodologies that were being used in that time, between the 1930s and into the 1970s, were these Zener cards, right? They would be used by parapsychologists to investigate telepathy, clairvoyance, and precognition. We'll look at detailed examples. When we compare anomalistic psychology and parapsychology in one of our later lectures. But Ryan was also one of the first people to study psychokinesis. He tried seeing if his participants could influence the outcome of dice tosses, for example. Now, I mentioned we're not going to get into too much detail here, but if you want, I've provided a link in the slides. I'll also link it in the description of this video, of some modern-day parapsychologists at the Rhine Research Center. No big surprise there, named after J.B. Rhine. No longer associated with Duke University, though. Interesting that. But, in any case, they use these Zener cards to test for telepathy, and you may be surprised by the results they get, or you might not be surprised. I don't know. Watch the video. It's kind of interesting to see what the results are. Now, after the 1970s, it was abundantly clear that Ryan's early successes were very hard to replicate, and there were even some recorded cases of fraud in certain parapsychological circles, which I will leave you to read about in Hyman's paper. But some thought that maybe we could address the methodological problems or the problem of replicability by improving the research tools of parapsychology. For example, the symbols on these Zener cards are abstract. You've got circles, wavy lines, whatever. They don't mean anything to anybody. So experimenters started using less abstract and more emotionally charged or meaningful symbols. So like pictures of people or clips from films or something like that, rather than this abstract stuff on the Zener cards. Things got a little bit more technological too. I mean, people started using computers to see if people could influence random number generators rather than dice rolls when it comes to psychokinesis. But most recently, something called the Gansfeld Psi Experiments have been used as the primary means in parapsychology to understand or to investigate telepathy, clairvoyance, and the like. So a Gansfeld, that's German, it means the whole field. Basically, Gansfeld experiment is when we have a sender and a receiver, and they're in different rooms. And the sender is trying to communicate a thought to the receiver, probably a thought about, an object like, I don't know, a lamp, right? So the receiver is listening to white noise in her headphones. She's blindfolded, she can't see anything. The room is dark with only a red light shining. And the sender is trying to send this mental image to the receiver. Now, the receiver talks out loud, describes what she can see in her mind's eye, and then finally, once she's removed from the Gansfeld state, that is, from the experimental condition where she's blindfolded and listening to white noise, she's asked to choose from amongst a number of objects which was communicated to her. So maybe I have 3 different kinds of lamps. I actually do have a few different kinds of lamps in here, you just can't see them. But maybe she's shown 4 different kinds of lamps, and her task is to pick the correct one that the sender was sending, right? So these results, of course, depend on whether the receivers identify the correct object at a rate that's greater than chance. They need to have a hit rate higher than chance. And even if they do, there are still some methodological problems with Gansfeld experiments, which we will talk about again later on when we discuss parapsychology in more depth. And nowadays, I mean, we can run these things with computers controlling what stimuli are being sent. A picture comes up of a particular lamp, and that's what the sender is supposed to send, and so on and so forth. The experimenters don't know, so they're kept naive, so it's double blind to try to take out some of the human error. So when computers are used this way, they're called auto Gansfeld Psi Experiments. So anyway, we haven't delved too deeply into all of this research, but one thing that's fairly interesting that comes out of Hyman's paper is that parapsychologists, at least modern day ones, tend by and large to maintain that the hit rates are above chance and serve as evidence for psi phenomena. They are, however, not often significantly above chance. Sometimes the odds against the hit rate are pretty high, but that doesn't mean, the odds against something occurring doesn't mean that being high anyway. The odds being high against something doesn't mean that thing cannot occur. I like to use an example like this. Imagine that I were to shuffle a deck of 52 playing cards, and I dealt them out, and we turn them over one at a time. And, there's going to be a particular sequence of playing cards, maybe a King of Hearts, and then a 2 of Spades, and then a 5 of Diamonds, on through the entire deck, right? Now, what are the odds that the deck was dealt in that particular order? Well, they're actually, pretty mind-blowing. Nevertheless, I shuffled the deck, and that particular order of cards was the order I got. So I don't know if hit rates above chance are enough to really justify the existence of psi phenomena. Skeptics, on the other hand, will argue that meta-analyses of these kinds of studies reveal that the hit rates are not really very high. Meta-analyses, by the way, are a type of analysis where we take a whole bunch of different experiments and look at all of the data across all of the experiments. So rather than just doing 1 or 2 experiments and publishing a paper, a meta-analysis might look at 40 or 50 papers and try to aggregate the data and see what's going on by getting a bigger picture of what's going on. And when this happens, when we do these meta-analyses, the hit rates are not very high. Also, a lot of meta-analyses find small or non-existent effect sizes, so that's another problem. Not to get too far into the statistical nuts and bolts of things. We can talk about statistics more when we talk about anomalistic psychology. But in any case, of course, one of the biggest things that skeptics will say is that a lot of the initially impressive results, like the results of Rhine way back in the day, have not been replicated. And that speaks to the point that even if these high hit rates are unlikely, that doesn't mean that they can't occur due to chance. But if there is a real effect, these high hit rates should be replicable. And according to the meta-analyses, they don't seem to be very replicable. So, now, I just want to say I'm not trying to be, overly harsh on parapsychologists here. There are some notable parapsychologists who, in the face of this lack of evidence, have in fact kind of changed gears and abandoned parapsychology. Susan Blackmore is one of my favorite examples. She is a psychologist who writes a lot about consciousness and memetics, and I guess what we could call anomalistic psychology. She's still interested in very very interesting things like meditation and altered states of consciousness, just without all of the magic, without all the parapsychology. She's now a well-known skeptic, in fact, and you can read about her, her abandonment of parapsychology in a little recommended reading that I've added to the slides here and that I will post on See You Learn. There are also others who aren't parapsychologists, but who kind of know the tricks of the trade. So what do I mean by that? Well, Ray Hyman, the fellow who wrote the paper that I'm borrowing a lot of this material from, is a psychologist, not a parapsychologist, but he also used to be a magician and a mentalist. So we all know what magicians are. What are mentalists? Mentalists are magicians who, use things like apparent psychic powers and mind reading and this kind of thing in their act, but it's not really something psychical or psionic. It's just a trick or an illusion or an effect. So thinkers like Ray Hyman, along with magicians going all the way back to Harry Houdini and even earlier, through James Randi, modern day people like Penn and Teller, Chris Angel, Darren Brown, they all perform acts of mentalism, but they don't tell you that it's because they have psychic powers, right? They know how to do this via trickery and spend quite a lot of time busting fraudulent psychics, right? Which is, I think, if you're you talk about using your powers for good, right? Magicians don't even have any powers, but they are quite, socially conscious of fraudulent psychics. And there's a video that I'll link you to that's also linked in my slides of James Randi demonstrating how you can do things like bending spoons and keys, where people claim to be doing this with their mind, but really James Randi just does it with misdirection and whatnot. There are other techniques for doing these kinds of things which magicians and fraudulent psychics use, by the way. Things like cold reading, hot reading, misdirection, force choices, or forcing. Talk about an idea for special topics. We could do magic in the paranormal. Not like magic, like not magic with a K. I mean like magic like stage magic. And how stage magicians and close-up magicians and parlor magicians do these tricks and don't claim that they're a result of any kind of paranormal ability. That would be a really cool special topics thing to consider. In any case, I think that's all I'll say about parapsychology today, because I do want to devote at least one more lecture to it. But you should have a basic idea following this lecture of what kinds of things parapsychologists study. You've got a rough idea of some of the terminology. And you've also got an idea of what the paranormal is, what we're referring to, or at least what we're going to be calling paranormal in this class. There's paranormal in the strict sense, like the parapsychological stuff. And there's paranormal in a broad sense, like UFOs and Bigfoot and Bermuda Triangle and all of that, right? So anyway, that's my kind of introduction to paranormal stuff and the parapsychological. So what are we going to talk about next time? Let's talk about that real quick before we wrap it up. So for the next couple of lectures, we're actually going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to read a little bit about the psychology of the uncanny. This might seem like it's coming out of left field, but the psychology of the uncanny is really interesting because it can help us to explain things that are often lumped into that paranormal, supernatural kind of category, right? Like especially ghosts, creepy things, haunting or eerie or creepy phenomena. A lot of this can be explained with a look at some of the early work on the psychology of the uncanny. The uncanny, by the way, is this kind of sense that something is familiar or known and yet unknown and foreign and unfamiliar at the same time. So, the uncanny is refers to the nature of the phenomena, the feeling associated with it, I take to be eeriness. I think of eeriness as an emotion, and when you have this sense of eeriness, you're having an emotional response to some kind of uncanny phenomena. But I'll explain this when we talk about it. Also, this will dovetail pretty nicely with our discussion of ghosts, which I think will be fun, and which will not just be about ghosts, but about seances and mediumships and stuff like that. So for the next lecture, you'll want to read On the Psychology of the Uncanny by Ernst Jentsch, and you'll want to read The Sandman by E.T.A. Hoffman. We'll cover those in the lecture number 1 about the uncanny, and then in part 2 of the lecture on the uncanny, we'll be talking about Freud and his paper, The Uncanny. But for now, just read Jentsch and Hoffman for the next class. So, that is all for now. Oh yes, your first critical response will be due this upcoming Friday, the 10th. So, you'll have to respond to something in this lecture or in one of the readings that I've made available for this lecture. I'm thinking that you should probably keep it simple. Pick something that's paranormal or supernatural and argue why it is or should be considered paranormal, or maybe why we shouldn't call it paranormal. Should the paranormal be restricted to the kinds of things that parapsychologists study, or can we use the paranormal to describe other phenomena like the Bermuda Triangle or UFOs? That's the kind of thing I think you should do. And by the way, I don't mind if your first critical response is a little bit shorter. 500 words should be okay for this first one, just to get you kind of into the swing of things, okay? But remember, try to write clearly and concisely, and if you cite any of these papers, make sure they're cited properly in your critical response. And if you have any other questions, let me know. All right, so that's it for today. I hope you find these next readings very interesting, and I will see you all next time. Bye for now.